Welcome, everyone. Good morning to our colleagues in the US and good afternoon to our colleagues in Europe. At our event today on Inequalities, Inclusion and Employment, a transatlantic perspective. My name is Zsolt Darvas. I'm a senior fellow at Bruegel, and I'm delighted to chair this discussion with two distinguished panelists. Maxime Cerruti, who is the Director of Social Affairs Department at Business Europe, and Suresh Naidu, who is Professor of Economics and International Affairs at Columbia University. Unfortunately, Veena Dubal, a professor from University of California, had to cancel for sickness reasons. In this discussion, we would like to assess and analyze what were the reasons of inequality at both sides of the Atlantic, whether there are similar developments, whether the policy responses were similar, and whether we can draw lessons. This event is published or prepared for the framework of the Transatlantic Expert Group on the Future of Work, which is a multidisciplinary group of 30 people, about 15 from Europe and 15 from the United States, a project we run together with the German Marshall Fund of the United States and supported by the European Union. And we are very lucky to have Maxime, Suresh, and also Veena and many other colleagues joining this group. So in the discussion today, we would like to focus on, I would say, on two broad issues. One is a little bit on the past, and the other part is on the present and the future. Now, in terms of the past, we would like to understand better what were the main drivers of inequality at both sides of the Atlantic, whether they were similar or different. For example, whether the role of social partners or declining trade unionization played a role in declining or increasing inequalities in the US and also in some European countries, or whether issues related to changing labor markets like automation, digitalization had played a role, or if there were perhaps other factors, social policy, taxation, and social transfers. If you look at the raw data, what we see that in the United States, there was a long period of several decades when income inequality was going up. In the European Union countries, the development is more mixed. There were countries in which inequality went up, countries in which inequality remained stable, even there was a few countries in which inequality remained at a relatively low level. If you look at what happened more recently during the pandemic and more recently with high inflation, then we also see differences across the US and the European Union. In particular, in the US, there was a very dramatic decline in employment in the first half of 2020. But after that, there was also a relatively speedy recovery in employment. While in Europe, what we saw is that the employment response was much more nuanced. There was some decline, but not that much. So again, it's an interesting question whether these employment developments had any implications for inequality. And more recently, with the very high inflation at both sides of the Atlantic, various analyses show that inflation is particularly hurting the poorer segments of the society, not least because the fastest increases in prices is observed for energy and food, and poorer people typically spend a much larger share on ordinary income on energy and food. Certainly, at both sides of the Atlantic, public policy was responsive, both during the pandemic and also during the high inflation. And a number of initiatives have been put in place to address the adverse social impacts of both joblessness during the pandemic and high inflation in Europe. But before going that, let's again look at a little bit on the past. So I would like to ask both of our panelists to elaborate what they see as the main drivers of inequality and employment. And for the audience, let me know that you can ask questions online. So please go to Slido, sli.do, and then type inequality. And then you can type your questions or comments. I will monitor these questions and comments, and we'll ask some of them towards the end of our session. But first of all, let me ask Maxim to offer some initial remarks on the drivers of inequality and inclusion in the European Union.
Thanks a lot, Zsolt, and nice to be with you, Suresh, on this exchange here from the transatlantic perspective to look into important issues which are basically at the core of political debates and also, of course, the relationship between social partners. And having in mind that we have been going through a number of crises over the past years. And so I think it's a very relevant topic, and a pleasure to be part of this group that you mentioned, Zsolt, and to participate from the Business Europe's perspective in those exchanges. I mean, the first thing to say is, of course, that it's important to understand what are the drivers, but we need to also take into account the fact that we're speaking for the level of society, but that there is a good element of connection to the labor markets that is playing an important role here. And there is, of course, different individuals in all this. And different individuals have different priorities, different choices. And so, of course, we need to try to reconcile these different levels, what is really societal, what is labor market relevant, and what is the level of the individuals. And I mean, what I can see, of course, is that indeed, and you were pointing to this, Zsolt, the US and Europe are quite different, even though, of course, we share that we are competitive and open economy that works based on markets. And on this, of course, we have a lot of interests that we share in common in this world. And I think it's very good that there is experience sharing between the two sides of the Atlantic, and understanding each other, different choices that are made in the countries, but also for the European Union, having a view of what is diverse, but what is also common in the European Union. I mean, what is, I think, very interesting to look into is what is the state of play in terms of social protection, because of course it is at the core of what is being done to try to alleviate what is the situation of different people and to get the support where it is needed. And I mean, if you look at this, I think there is a very important finding when it comes to Europe, which is that we have very different rates of participation in the labor market, and inactivity rates in our societies are quite different in different countries in Europe. So it varies between around 15% of the working age population and more than 30% in some countries. So if you look at this as an indicator, it already gives you a part of the response on inequalities, because it goes without saying that when more than 30% of the population is inactive, so that means people who are not even looking for employment. And when 15% of the population is inactive, that makes a big difference, of course, in terms of the number of people that are able to generate an income for themselves, and what is then the expectation that can be placed on redistributive policies through social protection mechanisms. And I think one very important starting point is that I think employment and social policies need to go hand in hand. They need to go hand in hand to support people, but with the assumption that the people who can work and that are in the working age, they need to be working and incentivized in getting into the labor market. And of course, that is a very important first part of the response to try to limit inequalities as much as possible, because a lot remains in the individual's responsibility and the support of societies and institutions to have as many as possible individuals that are going to be able and have the right competencies to be active on the labor markets. Then there is, of course, the question of how best to organize social protection systems. I mean, we are at an important stage at the European level on this, because there is, as you may know, a high-level expert group that has been started with the purpose of looking into the future of social protection in Europe. And it goes without saying that a key driver of change where social protection financing is needed and will be more needed is aging of our societies. We have more people in the older age cohort, and we expect significant numbers to retire. I mean, the expectation is that in the coming 2 decades, around 10% of our labor market in Europe, this is more than 20 million out of a total of around a bit less than 200 million people who are employed. That means that it's a significant gap that will need to be compensated. And of course, it means to have enough people who come into the labor market. So I think an important part is, of course, to create these incentives. And one measure that we have promoted as Business Europe is in-work benefits. So in-work benefits, why is it effective? It's on the side of the labor supply. So it's for people. It is basically trying to make sure that work pays, that people are better off when they work compared to when they are inactive and on benefits. Of course, keeping in mind all the people who are inactive because they cannot work. I mean, there is a significant part of this group that maybe with severe disabilities and cannot work, and that is, of course, fully understood. But for all those who can work, I think it's very important to make progress. Of course, skills training is also very important as a vector. And I think in Europe, we have rather good vocational education and training systems. For example, young people in the countries where there are good functioning systems go through the dual training approach in good numbers. And we see that when this is working well, usually youth unemployment is lower. So, I mean, of course, you know, one of the groups is the NEETs, the young people who are not in education, training, or employment. And I think here apprenticeships is, for example, a very useful response, policy response that needs to be leading to changes for the countries to have their good systems in place. But if you look at the overall challenge of today, I think labor and skill shortages, of course, are very important. Where we see that in this energy crisis, many companies are being hit. But at the same time, we see that those labor and skill shortages that pre-existed to this energy crisis and that was part of the recovery after COVID, they remain and are likely to remain due to this demographic aging issue that I already flagged, which means that we have a structural evolution in Europe where we have not enough people who are active on the labor markets to be able to grow. And so economic migration is also an important part of the response for Europe, to have more people coming from third countries to Europe and to have people who are as much as possible with the right kind of skills for the jobs we have and their evolutions. I mean, it's also, of course, in connection with the way the benefit systems are organized. And on this, I think there is some activities at the European level on access to social protection. So it is basically aiming to organize access for different people in different types of employment, and also including the question of how to do it for the self-employed, which I think is an important issue. And progress is going on at the national level. But we really need to have the social partners part of this work. And this is our key message to this high-level expert group that I just mentioned on the future of social protection and the welfare state in Europe. I mean, we need to ensure that we use our resources appropriately, because there is a competitiveness element there. We have already non-wage labor costs that are very high in Europe. I think when you look at the data on social protection expenditures, it's a bit less than 30% of our GDP that is spent on social protection in Europe. it's good to invest in people, and it's good to have people who are healthy and who can work. But on the other hand, when it's about creating new resources and having more, I think it should also be about reviewing what we have and make sure that we target for reallocations and savings where we can, because we are in a period of high inflation, as you were mentioning, and so interest rates for debt and the deficits are also going up. And I think we should not overestimate the capacity of member states and the public authorities to get access to finance. But it is also, of course, very important to progress structurally so that we have as many people as possible with the right skills, able to work, available for the labor markets. Enabling services like childcare play an important role to free the time for parents. And when you look at the future, of course, it's very important that the overall taxation burden remains what can be done for the competitiveness of our region in Europe, in the world. And today there are big fears around deindustrialization relating to the energy crisis. So we should really pay attention that we make sure that employers, that companies in Europe are able to thrive, and that the regulatory burden is not going to put them at a disadvantage and in a difficult position. So yeah, there is a lot to think and to do. I think member states in the governments have an important responsibility for social protection because it's a national competence at the European level. The social partners, you were mentioning it, Joel, of course, play an important role as well. In Europe, we have different ways of doing it, but we have in our DNA to have a well-developed social partnership. And I think, of course, this is good to be able to adapt the working conditions, the pay, but also all the other aspects of working conditions to a changing economic cycle. So it's important at this time, when we have a social dialogue initiative being prepared at the European level, that this is done in a good way to strengthen the autonomy of social partners, to strengthen the organizations of social partners across Europe, and that we are able to really combine economic and social success in a good way for employers and workers, and further improve what we have already quite well developed in Europe in terms of social dialogue. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maxim, for this very comprehensive overview of also emphasizing the importance of employment as a key tool of fostering employment coming out of inactivity as a key tool for fostering more equity. I will come back to you asking question about the inequality within those who are employed, because you are right that in some countries, certainly the inactivity is much higher than in others. But also if you look at the employment rates, we do see that it's going up in many, many European countries. But before that, let me turn to Suresh. So Suresh, I hear your voice suggests that you might not be fully healthy. So thank you very much for joining.
Yeah,
I look forward to listening to your comments. Thank you.
Okay, so my comments will echo a lot of what Maxime said. I want to start by talking about, when we had to think about what are the sources of inequality versus, in both sides of the Atlantic, I want to draw a line again between, I guess, what are sort of called predistribution versus redistribution. And, like predistribution are kind of all of the policies that matter that determine the market distribution of income. And redistribution is all the tax and transfer policies that happen afterwards. And what I think recent research has sort of really showed, this paper by Piketty and co-authors, is that the real source of divergence between Europe and the US seems to be in predistribution, not redistribution. So it's not so much that the tax and transfer system is that much more progressive in Europe than in the US. In fact, in many dimensions, it's more regressive, the reliance on VATs and things like that. But it's that the pre-distribution of income is much more compressed. And the reasons for that are manifold. It's not, of course, easy to line up. But, one of the things I think is first important to flag and start talking about is that the right comparison is the comparison of all of Europe and the US. Like inside the US, there are just many states. They're extremely diverse. And with increasing European integration, there's a lot of ways in which like the patterns that you see in one country are kind of being offset by the patterns in another country, such that you kind of want to look at the whole system to kind of form the correct comparison. And I definitely want to suggest there's likely a role for automation, although I'll admit the evidence is not kind of amazing on this. But at least within the U.S., it does seem that like labor markets that were more hit by automation, not robots necessarily, but just even automated mining or chemicals have like been much more negatively impacted in terms of like labor share of income and wages and employment than others. But what I want to really draw attention to is actually like the importance of underlying macroeconomic tightness, and which can both be supply side driven or demand side driven. But the idea that like what I think we've seen since COVID in the US is a remarkable like reduction in inequality. We've seen a reduction of inequality at the wage inequality. We've seen reduction of wealth inequality. We have not seen a reduction in income inequality. But I still think those first two are important. And I think one of the underlying drivers of this is just the ridiculously low unemployment rate we've had, particularly at the bottom of the labor market. And so there's ways in which like maintaining very, very tight labor markets, and partly that's because of the result of like very aggressive fiscal policy, and that's partly also responsible for some of the inflation. But despite of those costs and inflation, we have really run the labor market exceedingly hot at the bottom of the distribution, and this has pushed up wages disproportionately at the bottom. And so, like, this is one reason that like inequality has fallen, is that wages at the bottom have been growing much faster than wages in other parts of the distribution. And I think that is kind of a data point in favor of like very aggressive macroeconomic policy as being a very big determinant of inequality. And so as we think about central banks kind of raising interest rates and triggering kind of like a coordinated recession, which is going to be even worse than if they had just done it one at a time, that one of the casualties of that might be, in fact, that this wage compression that we've had as we lose. And then one of the byproducts of that has been kind of also a resuscitation of interest in collective bargaining in the US. And there's very interesting stories behind this. For example, like, again, this is just anecdote, but for example, like Starbucks, for example, becoming like a very important employer for non-gender binary people because of the healthcare that they offer that was expanded to cover gender affirming surgery and things like that. That meant that every Starbucks had a nucleus of gender non-binary people, of LGBTQ people, that were then the nucleus of the labor organizing that could happen there. And so that's like it took a long time to happen, but it's like there's definitely, and one of the things that's driving that increase in collective bargaining is the experience of COVID, just lots of essential workers just kind of left on their own and having to figure it out. Then that building a lot of social capital on the job and sort of really tightening workplace networks. And the second is also the very, very hot labor market, making it basically impossible for employers to retaliate cheaply. So like they can't fire workers because they need them so much. And so that like normal dimension of employer opposition to unions is attenuated because of the hot labor market. And so the other thing I think COVID will remain to be seen is if it's like spatially resorted the U.S. economy, where like people are now living in smaller towns, and so the big city gradients and things are like the high rents and correspondingly high wages in big cities might be falling as people like move to different places, they work remotely, and we'll see about that. The final thing I wanted to say about pre-distribution versus redistribution is that when you look at survey data, so we've looked at this in the US, and I'd be curious what it looks like in Europe. if you wanted to explain how much of the so-called growth of the Brahmin left has been due to policy decisions, it's uniformly the case that voters with less than college education don't like tax and transfer policies. They like policies that give good jobs. And it's only people with college degrees that really think tax and transfers are like a great way to handle egalitarian policies. And so I think and you can kind of date the pivot of the relatively educated in the US towards the center left party, the Democrats, happening roughly at the same time that the center left party pivots away from kind of good jobs policies and towards like tax and transfer policies. And so it happened in the late 70s, and it's roughly and it's roughly happened at the same time. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is that this is like this transatlantic conversation, but I'm like, you just cannot kind of keep the global South out of this discussion. And like the idea that there was going to be a partnership between two sides of the Atlantic that wouldn't go to talking about Latin America and Mexico and Libya and Tunisia and Morocco, is just, I think, possibly a missed opportunity, because these are the corridors of labor market mobility, of trade, of even capital market mobility in lots of ways that I think are going to be important levers for policymaking. And so, things like international tax competition and taxing movements of capital across borders, new approaches to trade that are kind of more nuanced than just free trade or just protectionism, I think, are on the table. But most, I think, important, particularly given climate change and age demographic mismatch that Maxime highlighted, is going to be like liberalizing migration flows from poor countries to rich countries. And what I think Europe actually has a great advantage in doing this is exactly the very well-developed nature of vocational training programs and active labor market policies. And if we could learn more about how to, like, if you had to think of what is the real brake on the flow of migration, it's got to be the ability to not just select people that have the skills, but actually bring people here and then give them the skills. And you can imagine that the European countries that have been so at the frontier of figuring out ways of retraining and getting people into new sectors, to use that organizational and technological know-how to kind of deploy that at the problem of increased immigration inflows, seems to me like the number one thing on the research agenda. And so I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Suresh, for this very rich presentation. Also at the end, going to major issues into the global South, and also mentioning some of the EU's labor market policies and retraining, reskillings tools that we have. Also, I very much like your comparison between redistribution and redistribution. And in fact, it was a bit of a surprise to me what you said, that the more, I would say, higher educated people are more for redistribution, but lower educated people is much more just for getting a job, which I think is very much in line with what Maxime has often emphasized. So as I see, the questions are already lining up in the Slido. We have now almost 8 or 10 questions now. But before going that, let me go one more round with both of you. So again, Maxime first. So again, one question I would like to ask is, what's your view on within work inequality, also across the EU? You mentioned, both you mentioned and also Suresh mentioned, that there are major differences across both the EU and also the US, which in itself is a very interesting. So one issue is how you see these differences within labor and across the EU. That's one question. And the other question is how you see the current impact of high inflation and what impact that has. So first, Maxime, to you, and then Suresh, and then I will read some of the questions which are made online.
Thanks, Roald. I mean, first, in terms of at risk of poverty, which is one of the indicators measured, of course, to check what is happening on the ground. I think there the way things have developed in the last years in Europe does not point to increases. So I mean, it's rather stable, which shows that the intervention has been supporting people. And I think something we have not yet touched on, which is very important for the Europe's response to the COVID crisis, has been short-time work schemes, which have helped. It was more in your introduction, Jolt. I think you were speaking about the employment trends, how it has happened in the US and in Europe. It's true in Europe that a lot was done and support given to enterprises and workers during COVID crisis to retain employment as much as possible. And that, of course, was a good response to try to shield and to help the companies going through this difficult period. Now we are in a very different time. So the energy crisis has very different triggers and reasons and effects. And so, I mean, of course, short-time work may be a solution, but it's not fully clear yet what will be the scale of the impacts on the labor markets of the current crisis. And so that will need to be seen, and first to mobilize the national schemes to see how, to support the enterprise and workers in this period of hardship. But of course, the issue of energy poverty has gained some ground also in the European context relating to the energy crisis. And there, as companies, of course, we've been the first hit. So energy poverty is for people, but what is quite clear is that disruptions in terms of access to gas and different raw materials and the supply chains of the companies have been really creating difficulties. And so, yeah, particularly in the energy intensive sectors, this is an acute challenge today. And as I was pointing, there is this risk of deindustrialization that needs to be really taken seriously by the policymakers in Europe. But your question is about the people who are working and poverty for these people. And I mean, the issue is, of course, that, the intention is to support as many people to get into the labor market. But the reality is that it's not an easy process for people who have been in situations of social exclusion for some time. So it takes time for the individuals to get trained and to get prepared also in getting to a job and being able to work again. and that is important because, the reason is also that some of the people that restart work after some interruptions in their careers for different kinds of reasons, they may not be able to work full time. So, you have all these gray situations where people are already putting a foot on the labor market, but they work only a few hours, 15 or 20 hours. And so you have this encouragement for the people to, as much as possible, work and be autonomous in terms of their incomes. And I think this is the right way to support the people with in-work benefits, as I was saying, to make sure they are better off when they work. Because then, of course, if you have people who receive benefits and are in the same conditions, it does not create the right incentive for people. But I think the fact that, it is a journey and it takes time, and you need also to have some time to be trained. And it may be also about redeploying life in a different way to be able to work. And so, yeah, this means that this transition is not always so clear-cut. And that's where, diverse forms of employment can help in supporting solutions for people to have access to the labor markets. But it's also financially to recognize that there is something that is relating to the societal responsibility here. Because these people may not be able to work as productively, or they may not be able to, be trained as they would benefit in the best way in the jobs that are there. And, for example, digital skills is very crucial these days, but if the people do not have the basic digital skills, it makes it very difficult to be employment ready. And so all these issues, they need to be looked at. And I think public and private employment services play an important role to support the people, but also to connect to the labor market reality of the companies. And of course, it's also in the remits of social partners through their negotiations, but also the social protection financing to be complementary and make sure that it creates the right incentives. But it goes without saying that when someone works 15 hours per week, the person does not get a salary for a full time. And so this idea of topping up, of creating the right incentives, is precisely the intention to try to activate people in a way that supports them and that puts the resource where it's about employment rather than being outside the labor market. And I think this is this employment insurance that is the right direction for the future. And perhaps to also have the chance to touch on some of the Suresh's messages, I think it's of course interesting pre and redistributive. What is the difference? And it was interesting to hear from you on this for the US. What I can see is quite different. Perhaps is the way different groups of people look at the role of benefits and taxation. I mean, you were speaking about the people who are not necessarily the strongest in terms of skills or in terms of work experiences, but rather expecting for a job. I mean, I think we need to be a bit more precise. Probably they expect a good income from jobs. So what you mean is the income in the pocket rather than going through redistributive policies. And I think this touches on some of what I was saying as well, which is that in order to leave space for social partners to negotiate wages, of course, it also needs to take into account what is the reality of non-wage labor costs. And in the end, these two aspects, they are connected. And both are important, of course, because there is a need for social protection and there is a need for a wage. But the interaction between both needs to be well understood, and there needs to be space for both to provide adequate support in terms of social protection, but also for the social partners to have wages that can follow productivity trends. And I conclude here by saying that I think probably for both sides of the Atlantic, one area for future that is very important is to strengthen in these times of change. And now that we are in the digital and green transitions, that innovation plays such a strong role and technology plays such a strong role. I think one of the key challenges for member states in the EU, but also, of course, the EU as a whole, and probably also in the US, is to organize these transitions in a way that is leading to productivity and that is leading to creating more space for economic growth that can then be translated in better working conditions through the social partnership and also in terms of the support to people. But in the end, I think it is really about the capacities of our societies as well to create the right kind of incentives. So economically, we need to strive through productivity improvements, and it has to be connected with employment in a positive way, in a complementary way. And that's where, as social partners, we played a role in Europe with an agreement on digitalization that is aiming to support the social partners, the companies, and the workers to do this digital transition in a way that is positive for employers and workers. But yeah, going forward, of course, it is also about having the right political focus in terms of having people in employment and creating the right incentives at societal level. That's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maxime, while you were speaking about the need for providing incentives and also for work councils, which are very specific institutions. So those are not trade unions, but those people in the work councils participate in key decisions and also have a key contact between management and the employees. And what that research found is that those companies that had work councils in place, they were more productive and also offered higher wages than those that did not. So I think this, at least this particular research, is a nice example for sharing the benefit, both creating faster growth and sharing the benefit. Now, Suresh, let me turn to you. So if you could also say a few words about within US differences, as you mentioned, they are great. Any hint what could be the driver, and also a little bit on the recent energy crisis, how does that hit US citizens and what to do with that?
So, I mean, you guys probably know there's this thing called the Republican Party, and it controls about like 50, it has like strong state control of many states. And you should think of like the policy environment basically between the sort of red states and the blue states as basically very, very distinct. And to the point that there's like one policy regime operating in the Republican controlled states and a different policy regime operating in the blue states. And, there's like a number of political economy determinants of that. Like you can think of natural resource extraction and, versus more like R&D kinds of production happening in these different states. But, I think to first order, it's like the underlying political control of these states that's kind of doing the work. And so, but, that said, some of the differences, like I'll give it just a small example. So the minimum wage, plenty of Republican states actually have minimum wages, but they're passed by ballot initiatives, not by the legislature. So everyone goes and they cast a vote for the minimum wage. Overwhelmingly popular, always wins. So like Florida, at the same time that it delivers a Republican government, also votes for a $15 minimum wage, which is very high. And interestingly, because those ballot initiatives generally have minimum wages that are indexed to inflation, the Republican minimum wages have been increasing at a faster rate than the Democrat minimum wages, which are not automatically indexed, instead have to be passed by the legislature fairly often. So you're seeing this like compression of the minimum wage differences between red and blue states. And so that's interesting. Let's see where, but it expands to everything from healthcare to unions to up and down the policy arena. What was your second question?
The impact of high energy prices
so one of the interesting things about the U.S., I think, is that high energy prices are like, the U.S. is making a lot of money off of, we're like an energy exporter. The U.S. is an energy exporter. And so while like when energy prices were very high for U.S. consumers, it's like, it was very bad, but they seem to be coming down. Like year on year, we'll see. Again, difficult to predict. But my sense is that the acute increase in the energy prices is, at least right for now, looks like it's somewhat in the rearview mirror, and has been sort of and has been slowly coming down, which means that the worry is kind of like more that it's like demand driven inflation rather than an energy crisis driven inflation. But in Europe it's very different, because there's a very much different shock to the energy system in Europe than to the US. And so I really do worry about the things Maxime was talking about, like the deindustrialization, the energy bills for European households being like triple what they normally are this upcoming winter. It's really a bad scene. And you can imagine that this is the winter, for example, to see that you could, like to whatever degree possible, figure out offsets for the energy shortages, particularly for like low income households. And I don't know what that looks like, but that seems like at least to ride out this winter, that will be probably pretty important. Both because there's going to be like a lot of jobs that don't happen because the industrial sector is facing energy shortage, and also because households are going to be squeezed on energy bills.
Many thanks, Suresh. Now we have only 11 minutes left and we have many questions from the floor. So let me ask some of them. Please try to answer briefly if you can. One question I find especially interesting is asked that how does differences in workers' rights contribute to EU-US labor market differences? So I wonder, you can have some thoughts on that. So again, let me read again. How does differences in workers' rights contribute to EU-US labor market differences? Does any of you have some thoughts on this question?
I can comment a little bit, Zsolt, perhaps. I mean, I think the focus on workers' rights is a bit limitative, but I think what is the intention with the question is probably to reflect on different labor market models in the US and in Europe, in different countries. So first, I mean, in Europe, as you all know, we have quite different ways of doing it. But I take the point by Suresh that in the US also different states will have different ways. I mean, what is quite clear is that I think in the US, on a federal level, but that's my impression, there has been some intervention in some ways, but I mean, overall, there is quite some leeway for the federated states to deal with some of the issues as well. When in Europe, we are in a context where workers' rights, I mean, to a large extent, these are national competencies, and we have some room for supportive actions by the European Union. And for example, just recently, as you may know, there was a new directive on minimum wage, which we think was another step in terms of going into the national competencies as employers. But just to flag that on these kind of issues, and I heard what Suresh was speaking about the Republicans and the Democrat states on this issue. I mean, what is the difference in Europe? It's rather between the countries where you have an intervention by governments and the countries where it's very much social partners dealing with it. I mean, it goes without saying that as employers, when you have systems where it's very much driven unilaterally by the governments without taking into account the economic situation and the views of employers, it is a concern because then it is politically driven minimum wages increase, which is, of course, not a good thing in terms of the competitive position of our companies, but it's also not a very good thing in terms of employment outcomes for the people who want to get into the labor market, because, of course, the lowest segment on the labor market in terms of wages, if it is quite high, there is some country evidence that you may have more structural unemployment as well, which is an issue to be taken into account. But I mean, all this is to be balanced. What I think is difference between the US and Europe is that, I mean, as European treaty, we define ourselves as social market economies. So we have this social orientation that is quite embedded, both in terms of the social protection approach, but also the social partnership. And we tend to work based on the cooperation between employers, workers, and the governments. And I think in the US landscape, things are perhaps less cooperative, and maybe that there are more divisive views between the different actors about how it should be done. And in the end, it's very much left to the very local level when there is more of a policy relevance and policy action in the European context. Active labor market policies is also an example of that. But yes, I think probably in Europe, be it with the social partners in the key role or with some role for the governments, we have a stronger role for policy in comparison to what is in the US. That would be my first impression.
Many thanks. Suresh, would you have some comments?
Yeah, so I think the narrow interpretation of this question is about rights, which I think the formal rights are important, but in a much more like long, 50, 100-year sort of context that we should think about the rights as not being so important relative to the kinds of I think what Maxime said, like the kinds of organization and structures that kind of govern the labor market being very different, of which the formal rights are part, but not encompassing of it at all. To be honest, like the UK experience is much closer to the US, for example, than the continental Europe experience on this front, and so like the formal rights as enshrined in the law, I think, are just part of this package that includes like a whole bunch of social norms, what employers are willing to, like what employer culture finds acceptable. So US employers are just completely intolerant of any threats to their control of the workplace. And so that just makes them very, very hostile to unions in a way that, like, you know, the employers on the continent have become much more accepting of like workers' councils and you know, co-determination and things like that. So I think the overall like structure of the labor market is kind of is enormously important, and workers' rights are a part of that, but not nearly encompassing of it. And let me just draw a point on it, which is that to the extent that we have this increase in collective bargaining and in unions and in strikes, it's not because workers have been given additional rights. It's because the labor market is so tight that the violations of those rights that happen can't happen. And so it's like the de facto power given by like aggressive macroeconomic policy have kind of really complemented, you know, have delivered workers de facto rights in an environment where they don't necessarily have de jure rights. And so I think like, and that sort of confronts my point that, like, you know, one of the things the differential response to COVID has flagged for me is like it's both a promise and a peril, but like that running the macroeconomy hot can really help with a lot of other social problems. Like, for example, even bringing people that were historically not in the labor force, when you have very, very high labor demand where vacancies to unemployment ratios are like 3, you can pull people into the labor market that you might have written off in the past. And so we're seeing that happen in the US, where like even disabled people are coming into the workforce. And so like the virtues of extremely high labor demand, I think like reflect fix a lot of other ills. You risk inflation as the cost of that, but I think that, but you know, I don't think the inflation in the US is driven by that, but it's you know, arguments happen both ways, but like the very, very high levels of labor demand driven by fiscal and to some degree monetary policy have been sort of an important part of this.
Many thanks, Suresh. I mean, this leads to another question. In fact, there was a question about inflation, namely, what is the role of profits and profit margins in the current high levels of inflation? And also it was noted that there doesn't seem to be a second round effect on inflation driven by wages, but what about profits? So what do you think about it?
Yes. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's definitely the case that profit share of income has increased. And this is why overall income inequality, I think, hasn't fallen, even though wage inequality has fallen, is that there's a component of this that's coming just from fairly high profits and pricing power. It's not clear. Pricing power can explain a level price increase, though. It has a very hard time explaining like the price growth rate, because you need like the growth rate in market power to be high, and that's kind of implausible because there's like a sort of ceiling on that. So I think there's like a role for it, but it can't be explaining all of it.
Okay.
And if I may, on my side, yeah, I mean, I think first there is a misunderstanding in terms of what is happening. What is happening is that a lot of companies are suffering at this time, and of course, I mean, the fact that the commodities, the price of gas has been so high, of course, may have had some impacts on some of the operators, and it has been part of the debates in Europe how to deal with this. But On the other hand, I think this was very much at a certain time, and we are past this. And on the other hand, it's not only that some of the companies have been having profits. It was, of course, the governments as well who received a lot of additional incomes relating to taxation in view of the taxation on these products. And the prices evolutions. So, I mean, what we are flagging in these debates is that the governments, they need to use well these additional resources that they have received through increased taxation. And to do so is not only to deal, for example, as issues we just touched on, like energy poverty, supporting people is one part of it. But now that we are entering in a period where companies are really hit and employment is probably going to be impacted, employers will need to be supported in creating employment as well. And so, you know, I have flagged in-work benefits on the workers' side to promote employment participation. But we are entering a period when I think it will be a lot about encouraging employers to create employment opportunities as well.
Thank you very, very much. Now we have only 1 minute left, and I have a final question to both of you. And this will be a transatlantic question. See if you can make one recommendation to your own country. Let's say, Suresh, you could make a recommendation to the European Commission and one to the US administration based on European experience. What would you suggest? And also, Suresh, if you could, based on the US experiences, you could make one recommendation to the White House and one recommendation to let's say, the European Union, European Commission, based on US experiences in terms of fostering equality, labor market inclusion and employment. What would that be? Maxim, would you please start?
Yes. So, I mean, what I think is a very important issue is skills training, because we have touched on it, but we didn't really go into details. And there is this year the preparation of next year, which will be the European Year on Skills. And I think this European Year on Skills is really important, and it should be an occasion for the government, the social partners in Europe to really work hand in hand. There is one key challenge, which is about updating the curricula and the qualifications, which are basically framed in different national education practices, but also industrial relation systems on the way social partners participate in the process. This is very important to have it right, because the jobs are changing. The skills content of the jobs are changing due to the twin transition. And yeah, in order to be in a good place with people with the right skills, with the jobs that are available on our labor markets, I think it is really a structural reform agenda for Europe to improve the timeliness of the updating of curricula and qualifications to changing jobs and skill content of jobs.
Thank you. Very good point. Suresh?
Mine is actually very simple for both, which is like basically like a set of pilot experiments to figure out how to design immigration policy the best. And so we just don't know. We have like very blanket solutions. We should just be like throwing a whole bunch of experimental ideas at figuring out, and that some of that is the skills stuff, like just figuring out all the counseling and re-education stuff that it takes, how to handle kids, schools. Like so I think the idea is like, we just don't know how to do it, but we can learn. And so we should be thinking about what is the set of like preliminary policy experiments and pilots that we can do and assess in the same way that we've assessed any number of other skills programs or active labor market programs. Let's like start looking at how to handle the demand for migration using those similar tools.
Thank you very much. Very interesting proposal. I hope both of your proposals will be heard. And I'm afraid we have over time now with a few minutes. So my very last task is to thank both of you, Maxim Cerruti from Business Europe and Suresh Naidu from Columbia University, for being with us and sharing your time and thoughts for these very insightful discussions. I also thank all the people who followed this event online and asked a couple of questions. Unfortunately, there was no time for asking all the questions, but at least we could ask a few. So again, with my thanks, thank you and hope to see you at other Bruegel events in the future. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you, Zsolt. Thank you, Suresh.
Thank you.